August 1942, Guadalcanal. The jungle breathes heavily in the dark. Rain clings to broad leaves. Mud pulls at boots with every step. Somewhere ahead, a branch snaps, then another. Japanese infantry move carefully through the undergrowth, rifles held tight, expecting the familiar rhythm of battle. One shot, a pause, another shot. The sound they know, the sound they trained for. Then, it breaks. A sharp, rapid crack rolls through the trees. Not a machine gun, not a single rifle either. The sound comes again, and again. 8 shots in seconds. Controlled, precise, close. Men hit the ground instinctively. Orders are shouted, then swallowed by the jungle. The American firing line does not pause to cycle bolts. There is no break in the tempo. The sound keeps coming, steady and relentless, cutting through vines and darkness. For the first time in this war, Japanese infantry face a weapon that refuses to slow down, a rifle that fires as fast as a man can aim. In the suffocating confines of jungle combat, where seconds decide survival, that difference is immediate and terrifying. This moment did not emerge by accident. It was shaped by years of doctrine, technology, and a global war already burning across continents.
By the summer of 1942, the World War had entered a new and brutal phase. In Europe, Nazi Germany was deep inside the Soviet Union. In North Africa, British and Axis forces traded ground across deserts. But in the Pacific, the conflict unfolded in an entirely different environment. One defined not by open terrain or mechanized columns, but by water, heat, and jungle. Japan entered the war with speed and confidence. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japanese forces surged across Southeast Asia in the Pacific. Hong Kong fell in December. Singapore collapsed in February 1942. The Philippines followed soon after. These victories were not accidental. They were the product of decades of preparation, doctrine, in a military culture that emphasized discipline, endurance, and aggressive infantry action. The Imperial Japanese Army believed deeply in the fighting spirit of the individual soldier. Infantry were trained to close with the enemy, often under fire, relying on cohesion, bayonet charges, and coordinated movement rather than overwhelming firepower. Their standard rifle, the Type 38 Arisaka in 6.5 mm, and later the Type 99 in 7.7 mm, was bolt-action, reliable, accurate, and rugged. Japanese training emphasized marksmanship and fire control. Ammunition was conserved, shots were deliberate, fire was expected to be paced. This philosophy had served Japan well in earlier conflicts. In China, Japanese infantry frequently faced poorly equipped opponents. Against colonial forces in Southeast Asia, speed and surprise compensated for material differences. Jungle terrain, in particular, seemed to favor Japanese methods. Visibility was limited. Engagements occurred at short ranges. Small units could maneuver silently. The bayonet, still central to Japanese doctrine, felt relevant in close combat. The United States Army entered the Pacific under very different circumstances. Before 1941, it was relatively small and widely dispersed. Many units lacked combat experience. Yet American military planners had spent the interwar years thinking deeply about industrial war. They assumed future conflicts would require mass production, sustained logistics, and technological solutions to battlefield problems. At the heart of this thinking was the individual infantryman. U.S. doctrine increasingly emphasized firepower at the lowest level. Squads and platoons were expected not only to maneuver, but to dominate space through sustained fire. The Browning automatic rifle played a role in this concept, but so did the standard rifle carried by every soldier. That rifle was the M1 Garand. Adopted officially in 1936, the M1 Garand was revolutionary. It was a semi-automatic rifle, firing the powerful .30-06 cartridge. Unlike bolt-action rifles, it did not require the shooter to manually cycle the action after each shot. As long as rounds remained in the N-block clip, the rifle continued firing with each pull of the trigger. 8 rounds, rapid, accurate fire. A single soldier could deliver firepower previously associated with multiple men. Before the war, some questioned the Garand's practicality. It was heavier than many bolt-action rifles. It required precise manufacturing. Critics worried about ammunition consumption. Others doubted whether semi-automatic fire would matter in real combat. Those debates faded quickly once American soldiers began training with the weapon. On the range, its advantages were obvious. In combat, they would become decisive. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they carried the Garand into a world it had never been tested in before. Dense jungle erased long sight lines. Heat and humidity punished machinery. Engagements were sudden, violent, and intimate. Firefights erupted at distances measured in yards, not hundreds of meters. Japanese commanders expected American infantry to behave like other Western forces they had faced, disciplined but slow to react, reliant on crew-served weapons for volume of fire. Instead, they encountered riflemen who could respond instantly, laying down rapid, accurate fire without breaking position. The jungle compressed time. There was no warning, no buildup. When contact was made, the outcome often hinged on who could fire first and who could keep firing. That realization would spread quickly through the ranks on both sides, reshaping the character of Pacific infantry combat. The M1 Garand did not arrive in the Pacific by chance. Its presence was the result of a long, deliberate effort by the United States to modernize infantry warfare before the first shots of World War II were fired. In the aftermath of World War I, American military planners studied the trench stalemate and drew a clear lesson. Future wars could not depend solely on slow, manually operated rifles. Firepower had to increase at every level, especially among ordinary soldiers. John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working at the Springfield Armory, spent years refining a reliable semi-automatic design. Early prototypes struggled with durability and ammunition compatibility. By the mid-1930s, those problems were largely solved. In 1936, the U.S. Army formally adopted the rifle that would bear his name. It was the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle adopted by any major military power. Production was slow at first. The rifle required precision machining, and the United States had not yet mobilized its industrial base for war. By the time America entered the conflict in December 1941, not every unit was fully equipped with Garands. Some soldiers still trained with the older M1903 Springfield. But as factories expanded and output surged, the Garand flowed steadily into front-line formations. Training emphasized controlled, rapid fire. Soldiers were taught to aim deliberately, but also to exploit the rifle's speed. The manual of arms was different from bolt-action weapons. Reloading was faster. Follow-up shots required no shift in position. Instructors stressed that the Garand allowed a rifleman to maintain visual contact with the target instead of dropping his head to cycle a bolt. That advantage mattered in dynamic combat environments. Japanese infantry training followed a different path. Recruits endured harsh discipline designed to instill obedience and resilience. Marksmanship was valued, but so was spiritual resolve. The rifle was seen as an extension of the soldier's will, not a platform for volume fire. Automatic weapons were present, but limited. Light machine guns were typically assigned at the squad level, with riflemen expected to support them through movement rather than sustained fire. In the jungles of the Pacific, these contrasting philosophies collided. Terrain reduced the effectiveness of artillery and armor. Air support was often delayed by weather or canopy cover. What remained was the infantryman, moving, listening, reacting. Small unit engagements became the norm. Patrols stumbled into each other. Night attacks blurred the line between offense and defense. Japanese tactics relied heavily on infiltration. Units advanced silently, seeking to close the distance before opening fire. Surprise was essential.
Once contact was made, momentum had to be maintained. A pause could be fatal. In earlier campaigns, this approach often worked. Against forces armed primarily with bolt-action rifles, the rhythm of combat allowed Japanese soldiers to exploit gaps between shots. The Garand disrupted that rhythm. American soldiers could answer sudden contact with immediate sustained fire. There was no need to choose between speed and accuracy. Both were available. A single rifleman could fire several aimed shots in the time it took an opponent to cycle a bolt twice. In jungle conditions, where visibility was measured in fleeting silhouettes and movement rather than clear targets, this mattered enormously. Japanese after-action reports from Guadalcanal and New Guinea began to note an unexpected intensity of American small arms fire. Units reported encountering what they initially believed to be multiple machine guns, only to discover later that the volume of fire came from ordinary riflemen. The distinction was not academic. Tactical assumptions were being challenged in real time. Logistics amplified the difference. The United States could resupply ammunition in large quantities, even under difficult conditions. Japanese units, often operating at the end of long supply lines, were trained to conserve rounds. Fire discipline was not just doctrinal, it was necessary. When faced with an enemy unconstrained by the same limitations, that discipline became a disadvantage. As the campaigns dragged on, the jungle became a testing ground not only for endurance, but for ideas about how wars were fought. The M1 Garand was not a miracle weapon. It jammed when neglected, its en-bloc clip ejected with a distinctive sound. But in the hands of trained soldiers, it reshaped the tempo of combat. Those changes were felt most acutely not in headquarters, but in the moments when patrols collided, when ambushes failed, and when night attacks dissolved under sustained fire. It was in those moments that Japanese infantry began to understand that they were facing something fundamentally different. That understanding would deepen as battles intensified and as both sides adapted under fire, revealing the many dimensions of this confrontation.
For the individual Japanese infantryman, the shock was immediate and personal. Training had prepared him for hardship, hunger, and close combat. It had not prepared him for the sudden density of fire erupting from American positions. In the jungle, where sightlines collapsed and sound distorted, the Garand's rapid crack created confusion. Soldiers often overestimated American numbers, believing they had run into heavily reinforced units rather than small patrols. Fear did not come from a single overwhelming blast, but from the absence of pauses, no breathing room, no moment to move. American soldiers experienced the moment differently. Many were young, newly arrived, still adjusting to the climate and the enemy. The Garand became a source of confidence. Men spoke of feeling less isolated, less exposed, knowing they could respond instantly. The weapon did not remove fear, but it offered reassurance. If something moved in the shadows, they could answer without delay. At the tactical level, the Garand shifted initiative. In jungle firefights, the side that seized the first seconds often controlled the engagement. Japanese tactics depended on closing distance quickly after initial contact. That depended on suppressing the enemy long enough to maneuver. The Garand made suppression harder. American squads could pin down attackers using rifle fire alone, preserving automatic weapons for critical moments. Fire superiority, once concentrated in machine guns, was now distributed across the squad. That decentralization mattered when units were fragmented by terrain. A squad cut in half still retained significant firepower. Technologically, the Garand represented industrial warfare applied to the infantrymen. Its semi-automatic action turned muscle memory into firepower. Each trigger pull mattered, but the mechanism multiplied its effect. In jungle humidity, maintenance was essential, but the rifle proved more durable than many expected. Japanese bolt-action rifles were accurate and dependable, but they demanded a rhythm that jungle combat rarely allowed. The technology itself did not fail, but the environment exposed its limits.
These angles converged in command decisions and battlefield adaptations, where leaders on both sides had to respond to realities they could not ignore.
At the level of small unit leadership, the impact of the Garand became clear quickly. American platoon and squad leaders found they could maneuver more aggressively. They could split units, probe forward, and hold ground with fewer men. The rifle reduced dependence on centralized fire control. Orders became simpler. Hold and fire carried more weight when every man could sustain pressure. Japanese officers faced a harder adjustment. Their doctrine emphasized coordination and timing. Attacks were carefully planned to exploit moments of weakness. When those moments vanished under sustained rifle fire, plans unraveled. Leaders attempting to rally men forward often found themselves pinned down alongside their soldiers, unable to restore momentum. From the Japanese perspective, American infantry began to feel unpredictable. Night attacks, once a strength, lost effectiveness. Assault units, advancing through darkness, encountered immediate resistance instead of delayed reaction. Reports described American fire as unceasing and dense, even when no automatic weapons were present. Misidentification of rifles as machine guns became common. This misperception affected morale. Belief in enemy superiority, even when exaggerated, shaped behavior. Units hesitated. Reconnaissance became more cautious. Aggression, once a defining feature, dulled under repeated frustration. Morally, the confrontation raised difficult questions. The Garand did not simply kill more efficiently, it altered the experience of combat. For American soldiers, the ability to dominate engagements at close range reduced feelings of helplessness. For Japanese infantry, the loss of initiative challenged deeply held beliefs about courage in attack. Neither side fought without cost. The jungle absorbed blood and sound alike. Yet the psychological weight of facing a weapon that denied traditional responses lingered long after the firing stopped. These pressures built toward moments where tactics, technology, and human resolve collided at full intensity, moments that would define entire campaigns. The turning point did not arrive as a single, dramatic announcement. It emerged in fragments, across ridgelines, along riverbanks, inside tangled jungle corridors where maps meant little and seconds meant everything. On Guadalcanal, the pattern became unmistakable by September 1942. Japanese forces launched repeated night assaults against American defensive positions along the Lunga perimeter. These attacks followed doctrine refined over years: silent movement, sudden contact, rapid closing, bayonet work. In earlier campaigns, this method had shattered resistance. On Guadalcanal, it began to fail. As Japanese infantry advanced through the darkness, American sentries opened fire almost immediately, not with scattered shots, with rapid, sustained rifle fire that filled the night. Garands barked in overlapping rhythms. 8-round clips emptied and reloaded in seconds. The jungle lit briefly with muzzle flashes, then settled back into shadow, only to erupt again. Japanese assault units found themselves pinned before reaching striking distance. Men dropped instinctively. Orders to advance were shouted, then lost. The pause, essential for reorganizing an attack, never came. American riflemen did not need to wait for machine guns to establish suppression. They were the suppression. On the ridges above Henderson Field, similar scenes unfolded. Small American units, often exhausted and under strength, held positions against numerically superior forces. They did so by maintaining constant pressure. Japanese troops, trained to exploit lulls in fire, found none. Attempts to maneuver around flanks were met by the same rapid response. Further west, in New Guinea, the fighting around Buna and Gona revealed the same dynamic. Dense jungle and swamp compressed engagements into brutal, close-range encounters. Patrols collided at distances of 20 yards or less. Japanese units attempting infiltration were detected and engaged instantly. The Garand's rate of fire turned fleeting contact into decisive engagement. Japanese officers began to recognize the shift. Intelligence summaries noted the unexpected strength of American rifle fire. Some units attempted to adapt, spreading out further, emphasizing snipers and light machine guns, but supply shortages limited options. Ammunition could not support prolonged exchanges. The initiative continued to slip away. For American troops, the realization was quieter, but no less profound. Confidence grew, not arrogance, but trust. Trust in their training, trust in their weapons. Men learned they could hold ground under pressure. That knowledge stiffened defenses and encouraged calculated risk. These battles did not end the war. They did not break the enemy outright, but they marked a change in how infantry combat unfolded in the Pacific. The jungle no longer guaranteed advantage to those who closed fastest. The decisive proof would come as fighting intensified and as Japanese commanders pushed their men into increasingly desperate assaults that would meet an unbroken wall of fire.
As 1943 unfolded, the pattern hardened into doctrine. On islands across the Pacific, Saipan, Tarawa, Peleliu, the character of infantry combat reflected lessons first learned in the jungles of Guadalcanal in New Guinea. Japanese commanders continued to rely on aggressive infantry action, but now faced an enemy whose riflemen could halt attacks before they fully formed. On Saipan in June 1944, Japanese forces launched one of the largest banzai charges of the war. Thousands of soldiers surged forward in a final attempt to break American lines. The assault was massive, coordinated, and desperate. Yet as the attackers emerged from cover, they were met by a storm of fire that did not pause. Garands fired until clips ejected, then resumed almost instantly. Machine guns joined in, but the rifles carried much of the weight. The charge collapsed under sustained small arms fire. Survivors later described the sense of being unable to advance, unable to retreat, caught in a space dominated by relentless shooting. What once might have overwhelmed defenses now bled itself out in front of them. On Peleliu, jungle and coral combined into a maze of lethal engagement zones. Japanese defenders used caves and concealment to deadly effect. Yet when American units counterattacked or held positions under infiltration, the Garand again proved decisive. Night attacks failed repeatedly as rifle fire cut through darkness. The tempo never slowed enough for attackers to regroup. These were not sterile victories. Casualties were heavy on both sides. American units paid for every yard. But the balance of initiative had shifted. Japanese infantry could no longer rely on closing speed alone. Every approach risked immediate engagement. The Garand's role was not isolated. Artillery, air power, and logistics all mattered. But at the point of contact, where men faced each other in confined spaces, the rifle changed outcomes. After-action reports emphasized firepower density at the squad level. Lessons were institutionalized. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps adjusted formations and tactics to exploit what they had learned. For Japanese forces, the recognition came too late. Industrial limitations and strategic isolation prevented meaningful re-equipment. Training adapted in theory, but not in material reality. Soldiers went into battle knowing they faced an enemy who could fire faster, longer, and with fewer pauses. By the time American forces reached the Philippines and Okinawa, the dynamic was entrenched. Japanese infantry fought with determination, often to the last man, but the battlefield belonged increasingly to those who could control it through sustained fire. The turning point was complete. What remained was to reckon with the cost, and to understand what this shift meant for the war's final phases. The consequences of this shift were measured not only in captured ground, but in bodies, reports, and hard conclusions drawn after the fighting stopped. By late 1943, American commanders in the Pacific no longer questioned whether their infantry could hold against Japanese assaults. The question had become how quickly they could advance without overextending themselves. Casualty figures told a stark story. On Guadalcanal, Japanese forces suffered catastrophic losses, over 20,000 dead, many from failed infantry attacks that never reached American lines. At Buna and Gona, entire Japanese battalions were destroyed in jungle fighting where withdrawal was impossible and resupply non-existent. On Saipan, more than 30,000 Japanese soldiers died, the majority during ground combat or final charges broken by concentrated fire. American casualties were severe but proportionally lower in many engagements. Units that might once have been overrun held their ground. Defensive lines bent but did not collapse. In after-action reports, officers repeatedly noted the effectiveness of rifle fire in repelling attacks, often before heavier weapons could be brought to bear. The psychological impact was equally significant. Japanese infantry entered battle knowing that surprise alone was no longer enough. The confidence that had carried them through early victories eroded under repeated failure. Morale suffered, especially among replacement units sent into environments already dominated by enemy firepower. For American troops, the aftermath reinforced belief in their equipment and doctrine. The Garand became more than a rifle, it became a symbol of reliability. Soldiers trusted it in rain, mud, and darkness. That trust translated into steadier defenses and more aggressive patrols. Japanese commanders attempted adjustments. Emphasis shifted toward fortified positions, caves, and static defense. Open assaults became rarer, not by choice, but by necessity. The jungle, once an ally, had become contested ground. These outcomes reshaped operational planning across the Pacific, influencing how islands were assaulted, how defenses were constructed, and how infantry engagements were expected to unfold. The broader implications would emerge as the war pushed closer to Japan itself.
As American forces advanced across the Pacific, the lessons learned in jungle firefights became institutional knowledge. Training manuals were revised, squad compositions were refined. Fire and maneuver doctrine leaned heavily on the assumption that every rifleman could deliver sustained, accurate fire. The Garand was no longer a novelty, it was the standard by which infantry weapons were measured. Japanese military planners, constrained by industrial collapse and strategic isolation, had little opportunity to respond materially. Efforts to increase automatic weapon production fell short. Ammunition shortages worsened. Infantry units fought with what they had, often adapting tactics out of desperation rather than design. Defensive warfare replaced offensive doctrine, but even fortified positions struggled when subjected to coordinated infantry fire supported by artillery and air power. Post-war analysis confirmed what battlefield experience had already revealed. Allied evaluators noted that the M1 Garand gave American infantry a decisive edge in close combat. It did not win battles alone, but it multiplied the effectiveness of the men who carried it. Japanese after-action accounts and surviving testimonies frequently reference the intensity of American rifle fire, describing engagements where advance seemed impossible despite numerical advantage. The legacy extended beyond World War II. The Garand influenced post-war rifle development worldwide. Semi-automatic and later automatic rifles became standard. The idea that every infantryman should possess significant individual firepower reshaped military thinking. For the soldiers who fought in the Pacific, the aftermath was quieter. The jungle reclaimed battlefields. Weapons rusted where they fell. But memories remained, of sudden contact, of relentless noise, of the moment when expectations collapsed under reality. The war moved on, but those encounters left a permanent mark on how infantry combat was understood, remembered, and taught. What remained was reflection on technology, on human endurance, and on the cost of adapting too late.
The roar of the M1 Garand in the Pacific jungle was more than a sound. It was a statement of change. In the dense foliage, where eyes strained to see and ears strained to interpret, the rifle rewrote the rules of engagement. It was not invincible, nor did it remove the chaos of combat, but it offered a new rhythm,
One measured in rapid, controlled pulses rather than slow, deliberate strikes. For the Japanese infantry, it became a harsh teacher. Training, courage, and discipline were not enough when the enemy could maintain unbroken fire. Time itself seemed compressed under its cadence. Soldiers learned, painfully, that initiative could slip through their fingers despite valor or planning. For American forces, the Garand embodied confidence rooted in preparation and industry. It reflected years of design, training, and logistical foresight. In the crucible of jungle warfare, that combination, man, weapon, and doctrine, proved decisive. The encounters left lessons far beyond the Pacific Islands. They reshaped ideas about infantry combat, weapon design, and human adaptability. They reminded commanders that technological advantage, when integrated with disciplined soldiers, could define outcomes before strategy alone was even applied. And yet, amidst these lessons, there remained a human cost. Men on both sides endured fear, exhaustion, and loss. The jungle, once silent, had witnessed a transformation in warfare, a collision of spirit, skill, and technology. In the end, the echoes of those semi-automatic bursts faded, but their impact on history and on the understanding of human endurance in combat endured far longer.